this now. Hi, and welcome to Austrade's Landing Pad Programs 101 with David Brown. My name is Charlotte Connell, Head of Engagement here at Climate Salad. And before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And for me, that's the Gubbi Gubbi people. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm going to hand over straight to David to take us through the Austrade Landing Pad Program.
Thanks, Charlotte, and it's great to be here today. I'm joining you from slightly soggy Sydney today, and nice and cool. But I'm usually based in San Francisco, where I've lived for the last 5.5 years, and been with Austrade for about 2.5 of that. Prior to my time at Austrade, I worked as the first hire for an Aussie tech company in the communications space. And built their US presence for them as the first hire. So I've been through it directly for a company, and now in my role as a landing pad manager, I get to help a bunch more Aussie companies make the step over to the US. I'm going to speak for about 15 minutes today about some US market entry tips, just generally. I can give you some insights on the current state of venture capital there at the moment, and then run through how our program can help Australian companies go through that process. And also with me, as Charlotte mentioned, DW, Delius Wilson, who's one of our entrepreneurs in residence, who works one-on-one with our companies in relation to sales and marketing. Specifically, and we have other entrepreneurs in residence with other areas of expertise as well that we tap into, and of course Mick Libinskas, who I'm sure most of you know, was also a landing pad EIR back in the day, just before I started. So good collaboration there. But maybe before we do get started, if anyone wants to volunteer any sort of questions or topics that they want us to cover today, that might help guide the discussion. But so does anyone have anything that they're really interested in getting out of the session that they want to volunteer before we kick off?
I have a quick question, David. Is the US really that huge when it comes to tech, particularly Silicon Valley? Does it live up to the hype?
Yeah, we'll go through some numbers just in relation to the size of the market at the beginning of the session. But yeah, good question. I think it is everyone's first choice of market to go to because of those sort of blinding lights. But that doesn't always make sense for everyone's technology. So part of the role we do at Austrade is helping companies decide which markets they might want to go into first. But yeah, pretty hot at the moment, pretty hot for tech and pretty hot for climate tech. So the future's looking pretty good there at the moment. Still a challenging market though, so we'll go through some of that.
I also have another question just for the, but I've actually got a poll that's just going to ask the attendees about what stage they're at. But you go straight into it and I'll figure out how to launch that. Okay,
cool. All right, so let me share my screen. All right, hopefully you're all seeing that screen now. Let me know if any issues, but yeah, so today, as I mentioned, I'll cover off a quick intro into Austrade, so you're familiar with who we are and what we do, and then touch on some tips to consider when entering US market, including general, what it's like to do business in the US, assessing your readiness for the US market, how you might go about gaining traction in the early days, and then ultimately leading to US fundraising if that is an ambition of yours. And then also some general housekeeping matters as well to consider, and then I'll tie it up with how our landing pad program can help. So Austrade, for those who aren't very familiar with us, we are the federal government's trade and investment agency. We help Australian companies export, and we also promote Australia as a place for foreign direct investment. So obviously we're here today talking about the support we can provide to Australian exporters, and basically that falls into three categories. We advise, we connect, and we support. The advice sort of comes in around getting your company ready for export, selecting markets, and providing you with market research. The connections and experiences we provide in market include introductions, identifying who your customers and partners might be, and offering market experiences in market to promote your business. And then the support we provide is anything that sort of comes up along that journey in terms of breaking down some barriers, providing practical assistance, lifting your profile in market where we can, and troubleshooting as well, or sort of any dramas that come up along the way. The boxes in red, they're the sort of core elements of what the landing pad helps with. So market research and market insights about the market you're entering, introductions largely to the ecosystem, service providers, partners, investors, potential customers. The market experiences we provide include the physical office space that we have in San Francisco that is available to use while you're in the program and even beyond. And then troubleshooting comes in on the one-on-one sessions that we do along the way with your business. In terms of the Americas, we have offices all throughout North America and LATAM. So good coverage of the whole region. We have about 80 staff in the Americas. And on the right-hand side are the sectors that we focus on.
Hi, sorry, David, the slides don't seem to be showing.
I've had this problem before with Zoom. How about, they were showing before, weren't they? They're just not catching up. Is that what the problem is?
No, they haven't been showing. Sorry, we're trying to work out the poll, which is going now, but we haven't.
Okay. So if I share my screen again, window, share, can you see that?
Perfect.
Can you see that as I full screen it?
No, I can't see anything.
Can you still see it? Okay, so if I leave it like that, can you see it? Sorry, I think when I go out of full screen, that's when it cuts it out. Let me just keep it not in full screen then.
Yep, we can see it. Perfect.
How's that?
Wonderful.
Okay, so I might, yeah, okay. So yes, that's what I was explaining around the services that we provide around advising, connecting, and supporting. Our offices in the Americas, I'm obviously based in San Francisco, but we can help companies wherever they want to do business in the US. San Francisco, Silicon Valley makes sense as a good starting point, but we can support companies wherever they might need to go. Obviously, very easy to do these days with the virtual programming that we have. On the right-hand side are the sectors that Austrade in the Americas focuses on, more so at the moment from a foreign direct investment perspective. We haven't finalized the trade export sectors yet, but I think they're going to align pretty much with these as well. And the good news is that clean tech fits into this. It's not a standalone sector, but it obviously it forms part of digital technologies if that's part of it. Also leaning into the energy and resources sector, and to a certain degree the infrastructure team, which is sort of smart cities, which can be a tie-in as well. So the good news there is we have a wide range of offices that can support and good tie-in with your sector. So coming into what it's like in the US, and as we were mentioning earlier, the size of the market. Here's some recent figures that I pulled that just show the scale, obviously, between the difference between Australia and the US, and then I put California in there as my home state, just to show that that in and of itself is obviously a much bigger market than the whole of Australia. So the point being, you don't have to bite off all of the US to win a big market. In fact, what we kind of preach is that you need to stay quite focused and intentional on going after what you can attack, so you're not spreading yourself too thin and burning through your resources too quickly. But just some general observations in the US. comparing it to as a big market versus a small market of Australia, the pace of doing business is a lot faster in the US. People want to get on with things generally a lot quicker, but at the same time, it's more complex. Your competition is going to be much higher in the US. The number of times companies come to us explaining that they don't have any competition in Australia, but then find themselves in a very noisy market here. It happens quite a lot. Even if they're not direct competitors, it's competitors against budget, it's competitors against the status quo. You will find it a much more crowded market here, generally speaking. For that reason, your sales cycles are more complex. The sales activities you're going to have to tick off are a lot higher, and your conversions will be generally lower. But the compensator for that is that the volume and deal size is going to be higher, so it's still a worthwhile exercise to do. And the ease of doing business is much more complex in the US. We've got 52 states that essentially march to the beat of their own drum, and they have their own regulations, they have their own economic priorities. So yeah, doing business here can be quite complex. Another reason why focusing is key. And part of that decision is really, are you ready to come to the US? That we see a lot of companies that probably come over a bit too early and aren't set up for success in the US. And that really starts for me for assessing whether you have a viable marketplace in the US, and have you proven that with actual market research rather than just some anecdotal evidence. So the most important thing to sort of note is that product market fit in Australia definitely does not equal product market fit in the US. There are going to be changes that you'll need to make, and understanding your buyer and how they use your product is key. And that comes to whether your product is US ready and can it navigate and scale in this big marketplace. So really key to have a product that actually works and meets the needs of US buyers, obviously, and that can successfully scale at a rate that is much higher than you need to in the US. Hand in hand with that goes investment in terms of time and resources that you can dedicate to the US market. US market entry doesn't happen by accident. It is something you have to invest a lot of time and resources into. So having some investor backing is key. Very hard to go to market and raise money in the US at the same time. So we like to separate those two things. So ideally having a way to fund your time in market for 9 to 12 months is a good idea. And then is your team motivated to go on that journey with you? And do you have the right management in place to assist with that move? How's your Australian business going to be run while you're focusing on the US as a founder? All those sorts of things come into consideration. It's really important to tie all that in with a written export plan. Lots of companies don't do it, but those that do are the ones that we see succeeding. And that can be sort of start 6 to 12 months before you actually enter the US. A lot of this stuff can be done, remotely from Australia with the assistance of the resources that Austrade has and others has. And obviously, a key decision is whether you're going to relocate to the US or try and run a distributed team, partner with people in market, or try and just sell your product through resellers and distributors. That all changes drastically what resources and what time you'll need to put into the effort, but always be intentional and focused, and know how you'll measure success or failure, and how that's going to impact your long-term business goals, and what it might mean for either future global expansion to other markets or fundraising, things like that, because the failure rate is actually quite high for Australian companies entering the US. So be prepared for that and what it means for the business going forward. In terms of gaining early traction, we really see that there's no substitute for boots on the ground in most cases in the US. It is a market you need to commit to, and come in and have the learnings directly, so that you can, change product, change roadmap, build a team, maintain culture, all those things. But until then, it is possible to sort of appear that you have a US presence by getting a virtual office, using US phone numbers on your website, using US spelling in all your collateral, and that'll just help get a bit more buy-in from local US businesses, and remove some of the fear of dealing with foreign companies. In terms of where you're going to locate that physical presence, I'm not here selling San Francisco or California or the Bay Area as a place where you need to do business. That's up to you as a business to decide. What we can do is support you on that journey. What I think is important to is consider where your customers are. Good to be close to them, close to your market, close to your partners. Obviously, talent is a big point. Obviously, people are recruiting talent everywhere at the moment, but still relevant to know where your talent pools are coming from. And where there's a good innovation ecosystem and obviously access to investment, again, all of which can be done remotely these days. But there are hubs like Salt Lake City, Utah, Denver, Colorado, Austin, Texas, that are really buzzing right now and winning a lot of business away from the traditional startup states. In terms of driving revenue early on, the key that we find to success is really starting with founder-led sales again. I mean, you're building a business in the biggest market in the world. You really have to start as a founder and do the hard yards yourselves to understand the market, understand the buyer behavior. And so, important again to focus, I say a maximum of 3 verticals or target markets or target verticals within those markets, so that you're not spreading yourself too thin. As founder, you can find influencers and champions to help you on that journey. You may already know them from previous trips to the US. If not, then it becomes a job to network with them and build them up over your journey through conferences, meetups, social media, that sort of thing. That will go a long way in helping you get early customer traction and also investor interest in what you're doing. Find low-hanging fruit and consider smaller companies where you can still reach the founders. I think it's all well and good to try and go for the top end of town and win a big logo, but you'll find it a lot easier to sell to your peers and to smaller companies and to build up that traction over time rather than to go for a big elephant straight off the bat. But the key to all of that is developing clear and demonstrable value propositions. I think one thing we see a lot out of Australian companies in general is just selling their features and our widget does this, our widget does that, and not really focusing on what it means for the end user and the value that you're providing, which is really key to selling here in the US. I put here consider partnership channels. I mean, it's always something that people come up and suggest, but they require a lot of maintenance, and as a market entry channel or part of your go-to-market strategy, it's actually not always that successful for a lot of reasons. There's often a big power dynamic difference between an established American business and a young Australian company that's looking to enter the market. No one is really positioned to sell your product as well as you are. And we see that, from numbers, from reports that companies that rely on especially reseller and channel distribution for their products sort of grow slower than ones that sell direct. Now, obviously, there might be circumstances where you have to sell through partners or you have to go through prime contractors to win a subcontract. Like, that's all fine. If you have to, that's the route to market, but then they become your customers rather than the sort of end users of the product. So a bit of nuance there, but the warning I just want to put out there is that relying on it too heavily can be detrimental, especially if you're talking to investors that like to control how revenue is coming in, not rely on how partners might bring that in for you. Some other things to consider. Often we get questions about whether or not you need a local entity in the US, and that's the answer is no, you don't need one, but there are plenty of reasons why you might want one. Largely if your customers require one and want to deal with a US resident company. If your staff would rather be hired by a local US entity, which is usually the case. For regulatory reasons, if you need an approval or a license, you're going to have to apply for that with a US entity. But also to protect your Australian entity from liability, tax being the main one, but also just general liability. You definitely don't want the IRS sniffing around your global revenue. So it's good to ring fence that with an American business that you can clearly show what their income is and what their costs are and have tax tied up neatly there. In terms of entity types, you've probably all heard about Delaware C Corps and local LLCs. For obviously not an accountant, and lawyers and accountants can advise you on this, but generally speaking, LLCs aren't very well suited for foreign-owned companies. It's a pass-through vehicle, so that still doesn't tie off your tax, ring-fence your global entities from tax like a C Corp will. So key C Corps are the way to go, and it's also what investors want as well. If they require you to flip up, which means putting that Delaware C on top of your structure and having that as your holding company. But just on that, we're seeing some investors not require that anymore, especially in early rounds. So you can get a few rounds of investment through a PTY Ltd and worry about the flip later if and when an investor asks for it. It's not something you need to pre-package, generally speaking. In terms of visas, obviously you can visit the US on an ESTA without a visa for 90 days at a time. But if you're spending more than half the year in the US, you really do need to apply for a visa, either a business visa or a working visa. If you're coming for long periods of time, they're going to start being pretty inquisitive about what type of work you're doing here. So even as a founder, you may well need to apply for work authorization if you're staying in the US for long periods of time. And with that comes obviously international tax and how you're going to be structuring your revenue streams between Australia and the US. Is your US entity selling, or is it just providing back office support to your Australian entity, which is the seller? All these things accountants can get quite creative with you on. But for you personally as well, especially if you're spending a lot of time in the US, beware of the US tax net on your personal tax as well. That kicks in basically after half a year as well. So just saying to some fundraising quickly, I honestly, raising funds in the US is so competitive that it's a full-time job for the CEO or the founder leading that charge, and can take 6 to 12 months. And that's not 6 to 12 months of actively raising, that's 6 to 12 months of building relationships, getting to the VCs, keeping them updated of what your progress is, and then running a really effective campaign for sort of 3 months to close out the round. There are some really good reasons to raise money and that what investors want to hear. And there are things like you have great traction and you want to grow the team faster and gain market share away from competitors or potential competitors. When you have more demand than you can fulfill and you need extra resources to help that. And when you have an amazing team that's proven it can execute. And that execution has to be sort of seen to be in the US market most of the time. So again, providing that execution in market is key. Less ideal reasons that we sort of see people coming to the US for is because they need to launch their product, or even worse, pivot to a new product, to get new staff because staff have left, because they're running out of money, or to gain traction. They're all experiments that US investors don't like to fund. They like to see that all sorted out before you ask them for money. And obviously not every company is venture fundable. So key to understand where your capital may come from, obviously, what investors are right for you. Everyone focuses on VC because that's the vernacular, but the angel market in the US is a completely different segment and a very large market as well, and can be quite beneficial for bridging rounds between the US and Australia and the US. And there's also alternative funding, obviously revenue-based funding and venture debt, and strategic investors who have different priorities to VC investors. Just on some recent insights on the last 12 months or last 24 months, it's obviously been a boom time for venture capital through the pandemic. Lots of cash being raised, lots of capital being put to work, lots of big deals being done. It really has been a record-breaking time, and that culminated in the last quarter of 2021, the first quarter of 2022 being the biggest quarters on record for pretty much everything. But we're sort of starting to see signs that there'll be a bit of a recalibration period about to happen, and that's starting already, obviously, with the carnage we're seeing in the public markets, which is starting to trickle down into the private markets. So we'll likely see a delayed reaction to that, with pricing corrections and slower deal cycles already starting to show. So what that means for various different stages of investment, and what we're sort of seeing up until the first quarter this year, was that for angel and seed rounds, deal activity was holding up, still lots of deals being done. The size of those deals was plateauing, but valuations were still going up. But first financing is slowing. So just more money going into sort of sort of second financing and beyond, rather than first check in. So a little bit more conservative there by the investors. In terms of early stage VC, we have, again, record quarterly deal count, despite sort of some signs of headwinds popping up. Consistent deal sizes, again, still strong valuations, but more money going into fewer deals. And so the check sizes are just getting bigger and bigger, and that takes up a bigger proportion of the deals being done at that stage. Late stage is where we're seeing the impact happening because of those macroeconomic conditions starting at the later stage and will trickle down. But the numbers for the current quarter still to come out. So the count was still holding up on the last count. This graph here actually shows what the 15 biggest VC funds in the US, or largest Silicon Valley, invested in the last 12 months. So it sort of shows what's hot amongst the top VC firms that you will have all have heard of. And so things like fintech, health and wellness, DevOps, e-commerce, enterprise SaaS did strongly over the whole year. The ones highlighted in blue or light green there are the sectors that finished strong in Q4 of the year. So the ones that kind of ended with a bit of growth. And climate tech is down the end there to the right, probably the eighth one from the end. So not a huge slice of the pie, but again, this is just the top 15 VCs, and that's the tip of the iceberg of a very big market. So all that shows is that climate tech is not super popular within the top 15 VC firms. So you're going to have to look elsewhere to get your capital, most likely, because these VCs are focusing on other things at the moment. So that brings me to our program and what we can do. Yeah.
Oh, just on that previous slide, is that millions of dollars invested or billions? The 0 to
it'd have to be billions.
Okay.
Or it could be deal count.
Oh, okay.
That's a really good question. It could be deal count. Let's have a look. Geography.
Deal count.
Yeah, it's deal count. Yeah, deal count.
You've got better eyes than me.
Glaring us in the face. You're right. I knew that was there. All right. So how we can help. Our program offers market-ready Australian scale-ups, an in-market immersion program. Our job is to help companies, increase their export sales and create jobs in Australia. We do that by offering online digital resources, mentorship from experienced mentors in market like DW, who you'll hear from in a second, and then access to our networks in market as well, connections to potential customers, partners, advisors. And we wrap all this up in programming, which I'll show you in a second, and the 90-day residency at a co-working space in downtown San Francisco. In terms of our programming, we focus on 3 core elements. We focus on export acceleration, which is go-to-market planning, and how you're going to enter the US market, how you're understanding the size of the opportunity, the risk profile, starting to think about your competitor analysis and how you'll stand out. What is your go-to-market strategy and how you're going to resource that, and putting it all together in a plan to execute on. And then when you come into that's sort of like an onboarding thing. And when you come into the service, we provide a deep dive on sales and marketing and then fundraising. In between that programming, because it only runs for a few weeks each, the rest of the 90 days in between is all the one-on-one stuff that we do, which is access to our mentors and entrepreneurs in residence, in Austrade introductions and work that we can do for you directly, as well as events and showcases and things like that. We have a bunch of resources. I'll make sure that Charlotte has these slides so that you can access these links, but there's a lot of resources online on the Austrade website and also the export.business.gov.au website that helps you plan your export journey and give you lots of resources there. And the good news is that we have an application process open currently for our next intake, which commences on July 18th and runs until October. The dates aren't super strict. You can drift either side of that, but that's just when we'll be running our next group of companies. And again, I'll make sure that you'll have the application link if you're interested in that. But very happy to answer any questions you may have generally as well.
Thank you so much, David. Olivia, would you be able to share the results of the poll?
Yes, definitely. So I'm not able to share this with you publicly, but 5 out of 8 of us have said we're born ready to head to San Fran. 1 is hoping to go in the next 12 months. And then 2 people have said they're keen on a different region. So David, I guess, are there landing pads in other regions around the world?
Yeah, there are. So basically, Austrade has offices in 80 places around the world. So we have a really huge geographic coverage. Pretty much anywhere you'd want to go, we'll be covering. We don't run landing pads in all of those regions. Obviously, we run them in the key regions, which are Singapore, which covers Southeast Asia, Shanghai for China. We're about to launch one in India, in Bengaluru, and we have one in Berlin. Berlin changed to London, so it's in London now, and one in Tel Aviv as well. They each focus on different things. Like obviously, you're not going to Tel Aviv to win the Israeli market in many things. That's more for sort of innovation and product building. Whereas obviously San Francisco is a good gateway for North America. Singapore is a good gateway for Asia, and London's a good gateway for Europe. That's basically how we work. They're all, as I said, all a bit different, run different programs based on the market needs in market.
David, at the beginning of the call, you said climate tech is super hot right now. I mean, the reports across Australia are seeing that investment is flowing 5 times faster into climate tech as a sector than any other startup sector. And I know that chart with deal count was low for climate tech. But what else are you hearing on the ground in San Francisco? And obviously, I'd love to hear what Dalius Wilson thinks as well on this.
Yeah, I mean, the buzz is all around the movement from obviously the Biden administration and what they're doing, what they're moving towards. So obviously, huge focus on the infrastructure plan to do a lot in the climate space. Which is, may say not enough, but that will give a big opportunity regardless. And they can't do it all themselves. Like obviously, the US does have a big preference to buy local, and they have this whole buy American requirements that they have. But they can't do everything themselves. They recognize that. So there's good opportunity for Aussie companies to partner with American companies to get those projects done. So yeah, it's all looking pretty positive right now. I will put my hand up and say I'm no sector expert. I'm not very much of a generalist, but we can definitely provide deeper insights for anyone who has specific products or verticals in mind. We can get access to that information.
Great to know. With this cohort, is that boots on the ground, or can prospective founders join that virtually?
Preferences for boots on the ground. It doesn't have to be for the whole time, but where we can add value the most is where companies are ready to execute on those strategies, and that execution these days is becoming more and more beneficial to do on the ground rather than continuing with the virtual model. We're seeing companies that have gone over to the US and started participating in conferences and in the old way of doing things are starting to reap the rewards a bit faster than those that are a bit more hesitant. So the US has been back to business for a long time, really, more so obviously cleared up and got over things a bit quicker than Australia did. So for about a year now, people have been ready to sort of get back to things. We had founders coming over for our programs even in the late half of last year when borders were still restricted, and we had to write letters to get them out. And yeah, they've done really, really well. Sort of being on the ground here is sort of having that first mover advantage and getting ahead of some of the competition.
Mick, you have a raised hand there, and Mick was also entrepreneur in residence in San Francisco with a landing pad program.
Yeah, the quality of EIR has gone way up since I've been there, right, Dave?
Not at all, not at all.
Quick question for Dalius. A lot of people assume Australia and the US are really similar markets, and I think B2B, that's sometimes the case, but typically not. Can you tell us maybe a couple of quick key points about the differences of go-to-market B2B, and it also goes to Dave's point about US investors, like a US market story, about how you can get those first customers and traction there.
Perfect. Thank you for the question, Mick. And maybe it's been a blessing so far for all of you that you haven't had to hear much of what I've had to say, but hopefully that changes after this. I'd also like to say quickly, I exchanged my lifestyle for a lower carbon footprint. So I moved into a van and have driven around Australia since last November. So sometimes when you hear from me, I'm cheating and I'm Airbnb-ing, but for most of the time, I become quite proficient in having a low carbon footprint, which I think is quite a change in lifestyle. But on the B2B side of things, the first point I'd make is that the noise in the inbox in the US is a lot greater. And the reason is that there aren't the same laws and regulations around emailing en masse. So one benefit of that is that we can leverage that to send more emails at scale and to harness some newer technologies to do so. But the downside is if your messaging isn't accurate and it's not adding value, then you're in a little bit of strife there. I'd also say that unlike Australia, you have more, the market size is so much bigger that you can afford to perhaps market yourself to more of the smaller to mid area of town, whereas in Australia, that option pool is very limited. So in that way, you can afford to perhaps look at taking a lower ACV. Just out of interest, it'd be good in the chat if everyone could put what their ACV was, and then we could talk about it. And then another thing that we're seeing as well is the SMB is the new enterprise. So we're seeing customers really expect robust sales cycles with demos, technical consultations, things about talking about technical integration, all that stuff. When over here it's not as developed as yet. We'd probably just assume that would be in the enterprise. Finally, I just probably put there's other things I can talk about, but the SDR trend here, in the US, it's going to cost you in the end about 125 to 135K to hire an SDR, make them productive, spend the 500 to 600 a month on tools that they need. So although that's a really common thing, I'd suggest really heavily thinking about the trade-off for that capital. If you invested X amount into product-led growth, or perhaps doing more emphasis on paid or organic marketing, for instance, you may actually see a better short-term yield than investing in that salesperson. So I know as the salesperson on here, I meant to talk about pro-sales initiatives all the time, but I do think you have to tread with caution on that. So those are some of the themes that we're seeing that make the two countries very different.
And for anyone like me that isn't abbreviation literate, ACV, thanks Mick, is annual contract value, basically the average amount you charge each company each year. And SDR is that sales development representative that Dalius was talking about. And Dalius, you may be in an Airbnb on the Sunshine Coast because you kind of cut out a little bit there, just your visuals, but your voice came loud and clear. Joanna had a question too on how often are the boot camps run?
It's a good question, and it's sort of been fluctuating a lot over the last couple of years, just with all we've been going through. But it's essentially 3 times a year we do an intake. So we're currently doing the intake. That'll be the last intake for this year. Next calendar year, we may actually be moving away from cohorts and fixed intakes and servicing companies as and when they need the servicing. So it's a little bit of a watch this space at this time, but this July 18 cohort is your last chance this year to get on board and consume the service. But it is a continuing program, and we'll still be supporting companies next year, just probably under a slightly different model.
Carola, did you want to add your voice? I see your chat in the message there, or your message in the chat there.
Yeah, sure. Yes, just thought I'll put our ACV in. And as I explained, it's very, very different depending on the customer segment. So we're basically a subscription platform for electric vehicle charging stations. And it depends, like some small, medium enterprises may have only like 2 charging stations, and then it's the lower end of $1,200 a year. Whereas if we deal with the big corporates like the Lend-Lease, Charter Hall, or Woolworths, then obviously they have a way higher ACV for us. So yeah, we're separating our product into enterprise and SME.
Yeah, and for your company, pursuing a geographical based strategy where you're not targeting the whole market, but you're trying to attack the market in sectors, really worked for ChargePoint. They were one of my early customers when they were less than 40 people, and they didn't need me anymore by the time they got to 700-800. But happy to exchange some learnings. There's also an alumnus who Dave Brown can connect you with, Spot Parking, who is selling parking infrastructure into similar style of organizations. I think they'd be a good company for you to swap some notes with.
Yeah, that would be great if you could connect offline after the session.
It's a really good point Dave makes, and Dalius makes, and Dave made it before as well, is that the US is so big and really, really competitive that it's really hard to get a grip on that in Australia. And I really highly encourage every single company I've ever taken over there thinks that they're focused, and they end up being even more focused. Another company Dalius worked with, SafeSite, they had, I think like 14 clients in Australia, and we sat in LA airport and fired all the Australian customers to focus on the US. And within 9 months, just in Arizona, I think we had 600 clients on this SaaS platform. And other companies in Australia, they go with a broader proposition and end up going much more narrow. Like niches are very, very big. So it's definitely worth, and through Dalius, Dave, and myself, there are 100 Aussie companies that have been through it, and we've got a number of them as mentors as well. So just well worth getting some support to help you, because it can make a big customers solve everything, right? If you can get customers, and the capital will follow. So, and a US market definitely opens up that capital. So, yeah, great to have that support.
Mick, Dalius, and Dave, in terms of maturity of the climate area, we keep hearing from founders who have successfully navigated and scaled in Europe that the maturity of sustainability and climate solutions is much further advanced than Australia. How is it in the US?
Yeah, DB, do you mind if I take this a little bit?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, rather than specific climate tech or climate as a category, I believe that in my experience, we've seen climate focus within many of the major technology sectors. So if you look at IoT, for instance, I worked with a company called Pluto who is doing IoT devices for water saving, but they weren't specifically just about water saving. You could use these IoT devices for various other cases. So I'd say that there's an integrated or a consciousness around sustainability and climate tech, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the product or the software is categorized particularly as a climate product. Secondly, we're also seeing this evolution, and this has a big impact for sales as well, whereas climate tech was, it might seem like a funny comparison, but cybersecurity and climate tech sales were very similar in that you're selling against the fear. If you do not do anything about this, this may happen to you. But in many cases, if firms do nothing about it, there wasn't a cost per se. But now the market's evolved, and with different state-based legalities that have developed, and also consumer preferences changing, with now us wanting to pick goods and services that have more of a climate ethos behind them, we're actually seeing a real, ROI, return on climate tech. And so that's where I've seen the shift. The final point I'd make is that some states are a little more supportive of climate tech, particularly, California was one of the first to really promote different things. But I've seen a lot of Australian firms, they enter across Canada and the US, because Canada as a whole is easier than many US states. So they look to build some of the case studies and the proof points in Canada, and they're also supported, particularly in the northern areas of the states. So those are my points there.
I think two other comments from me really briefly is your proposition will be significantly stronger in the US, and speed of sales cycle, it will be much faster. So it's one of the biggest reasons to go there is your sales cycle learning process will be much faster. You often have in Australia, hand up if you've ever had like 50 cups of coffee or meetings with people to eventually get a maybe. It's quite common in the US. It's like, actually, well, you can give me a 1% benefit. That's amazing. That's fantastic. So I think Dalia's point is right, though. It's still rare to be purely based on climate benefit. You want to get it all right. Like it should be cost positive. It should be brand positive. It should be easy of implementation. Purely saying, hey, I'll make you look slightly better on carbon may not be enough. So, and the other thing is complexity in selling. You're rarely at for SME SaaS, like small business SaaS, you're selling to one person, but normally you're selling to two people in the company. So, but yeah. Go to Dave. Any more comments there?
Well, no, I think I was. You were all breaking up on me, but I think all your points were the right ones. Nothing more to add.
We do have time for a few more minutes of questions for this wonderful Lunch and Learn Hour of Power. Well, thank you so much. The obvious one, how do we reach out to you, or should we contact you directly, Dave, or go through the application process as we should? Oh, I might have cut out on you. Roger, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I really appreciate it. One of the things which I'm quite curious about is at what stage should we start to reach out? Because as a startup, we're quite early and we don't want to spread ourselves too thin so that we may not, we become unsuccessful in both Australia and the US. Do we establish ourselves in Australia first before heading out?
I think Dave's internet's cutting out. So anyone who has good internet would be able to answer, Dalius or Mick.
Roger, my quick points is it really is a case by case, but think about SafeSide as an example. My comment to them was if they try to build a business in Australia and in the US, they'll end up possibly running two subscale businesses, and the spread of your resources across two markets, even though they might seem to be similar, is actually really hard. So my key thing is if you're big market and your capital raising is in the US, then go to the US straight away, because product market fit in Australia is different to product market fit in the US. The middle letter M is market, and it's not the same. There's definitely lessons to be learned, but it's a decision to be made. Again, SafeSide, the right thing was to fire those customers and 100% focus on the US. Yours might be, you know what, I'm going to use the Australian customers to get to $1 million revenue and product market fit in Australia, and then I'll be we think I'll be 80-90% product market fit for the US. So it's a tough call to make that were worth talking to your advisors. But there are real consequences of, like, big assumptions. Definitely don't assume that Australian traction translates to US traction, specifically for investors. Most of the time it's deemed to be a emerging market and unrelated, a long way away, unless you're at the $5 or $6 million in revenue. $5 to $10 million in revenue. And the other thing is, don't assume that Australia and US are going to be similar in terms of your customers and their approach. They're typically really, really different.
Thank you.
Roger, I'd also add that there are some grants or initiatives that are predicated a little bit on having Australian customers, or even just one Australian customer. So my magic number, I'd agree with Mick. I'd say you either do 0, where you completely focus on the US, or you go 1 to 3. Any more Aussie customers is just going to slow you down, and you want to build a US first business if you want to take over the world. But if you want to build a solid business, then it's okay to start in Australia and keep scaling. But I'd recommend thinking about not getting more than 1 to 3 customers before you move.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry everyone. I think I'm back now. I was having some bandwidth issues there, but I think there was also a question about how to contact us and how to get in touch. Yeah, like LinkedIn works. So feel free to find me on LinkedIn, and also I'll make sure I share the links. Let me share the link for application in the chat now. And you can also find me at my Austrade address, which is just david.brown@austrade.gov.au. So I'll whack that all in the chat. Email address first. There's the email. And then let me get the link for the applications. They do close this Sunday, but if anyone is interested in applying for this round, let me know. We can extend the date for you. So that's the application process for this round.
And David has generously offered to share the slides as well, which I can share with you with all the that are hyperlinked to all those resources as well. Thank you so much for your time today. I'll make sure that everyone's copied those links in the chat before we, of course, end. Thank you so much for walking us through the Austrade landing pad programs in the States and all the wonderful support that there is on offer for helping companies. I was going to say climate tech companies, but you are sector agnostic. It's great to see all the support for startups to grow and scale in the US.